All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Margaret O'Mara. I'm professor of history at the University of Washington. In Seattle, where the AHA was going to be, where we're going to be meeting in person. I'm happy to report that one silver lining of us having to go onto Zoom is that it has been raining buckets and buckets of rain in Seattle. And I never like it when my colleagues come from far away and have their presuppositions about Seattle weather reinforced. So hopefully next time the AHA cycles through Seattle, it will be a gloriously sunny January. But I am really delighted to chair this panel on new directions in the history of education. I should say that our emphasis today is going to be, as you might have suspected from the people on the panel, it's going to be on higher education, a very important part of the whole historiography, in part because that we only have a limited time to talk, and also because we think that there's so much to explore within this field, particularly the work of our three panelists. We're going to go for a little over an hour today. That's our plan. We will have a hard stop at about 75 minutes, so at about 15 minutes after the next hour. It's 10 a.m. on the West Coast right now. Everyone's joining us from different time zones. Again, a beautiful part of this virtual AHA is that we can come from all over. So I'm delighted you're here. So let me just briefly introduce our panel, what we want to do, and the panelists, and then turn it over to our conversation. So historians across multiple subfields are now engaging and interrogating the history of education and higher education institutions in particular. This panel considers new directions in the history of higher education and its relationship to broader historiographies, including the history of capitalism, of political economy, and of knowledge production as material production. What is to be gained by this recent inquiry? How does bringing the history of knowledge institutions in line with general trends in historiography alter our understanding of 19th and 20th century US, European, and world history? So let me introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, and then I will begin our conversation. First, Emily Levine, who is also the organizer of this panel. So I want to thank Emily for bringing us all together and for making this happen, including all that she did and all of the team at Stanford, the support team that's helping this run right now. Emily is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education and associate professor by courtesy of history at Stanford University. She is the author of Dreamland of Humanists, Warburg, Cassirer, Panofsky, and the Hamburg School, published by the University of Chicago Press, which was awarded the AHA's 2013 Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. Her newest book, Allies and Rivals, German-American Exchange and the Rise of the Modern Research University, will be published this coming July by the University of Chicago Press. Ian McNeely is professor of history and department head of German and Scandinavian at the University of Oregon. A specialist in German history and European cultural history, his work also engages global comparative history and historical sociology. McNeely has written about everything from Renaissance academies to the management guru Peter Drucker, and is the author of multiple books, most recently, Reinventing Knowledge from Alexandria to the Internet, co-authored with Lisa Wolverton. His current research centers on the rise of the neoliberal university in the UK and the US over the last 40 years, building in part on his experiences as a 2016-17 American Council on Education Fellow, during which he shadowed academic leaders across the country. And last but hardly least, Adam Nelson is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Educational Policy Studies and History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author or co-author of many books on the history of higher education in the United States and around the world, and he currently is at work on two book projects. One titled Capital of Mind, The Making of an American Knowledge Economy, 1730 to 1830, and the second, Empire of Knowledge, Nationalism, Internationalism, and American Science, 1780 to 1830. He served as president of the History of Education Society and co-directs the annual University of Washington Peking University Workshop on Higher Education. So welcome to you all. So I wanted to open it up by asking you all to each in turn and in the order in which I introduced you just to speak for a couple of minutes. Tell us a bit about what you're working on right now and how you see your work reflecting and contributing to new directions in this field. Emily, let me turn it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margaret, so much for chairing and for moderating. Also, I should say to Victoria Delaney, a PhD candidate in the Stanford Graduate School of Education, for providing technical assistance, much needed this morning, and Ian and Adam for agreeing to be panelists, and all of you for joining the conversation. It's fun to see familiar names and now scroll in on the side of the screen. So I work at the intersection of intellectual history, history of knowledge institutions, and transatlantic history. And as Margaret said, I have a book, Allies and Rivals, coming out in the summer of 2021. And it makes a contribution to what I see as three important new directions in the history of education. First, my new work places the history of higher education more squarely into the history of the nation state, following in the trail blazed by Margaret and Adam. My distinct contribution in this area is to further contextualize that story in a transatlantic context. The book makes the argument that not only does the German-American exchange tell us something about these two countries vying for world power status at the end of the 19th century, but it also tells us something about what makes universities unique and how knowledge advances. Namely, that it's related to, but can't be reduced to the nation state, and that it retains a value system separate and apart from nations and markets. I imagine Ian and Adam will have something to say about that. Second, my new work merges two bodies of scholarship that are normally distinct. One that treats the university as an ideal, separate and apart from politics in the world, and a second that focuses on organizational questions relating to the university as an institution. Here, I emulate Ian in trying to connect intellectual history with the sociology of knowledge. And I see the university as an expression of a compromise. I call this, in the book, an academic social contract that emerges in a space brokered by academic innovators, balancing that ideal and the institutionalization. And three, I make it a priority in my current and future work to bring previously marginalized communities or historic outsiders to the centers of the stories that we tell about intellectual history and about university history, be they Jews, women, or Blacks, even if that telling is about how they were erased, to use the language of last night's plenary. And my particular interest is to explore the connections between marginality and innovation. And the reformers who use a strategy to tap underutilized talent as a source of institutional innovation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. Ian.
Yes, thanks to everyone who's here, and especially those who helped to organize. Flattered to be here. So back in 2008, I published this book immodestly titled Reinventing Knowledge from Alexandria to the Internet. Immediately thereafter, the Great Recession hit, and I signed up for a bunch of faculty committees and eventually made my way into an associate deanship because I was convinced that the world was about to change and I wanted to be there to reinvent knowledge once again. That did not happen, but I was able to kind of kindle and deepen a career-long interest in what I call practical intellectuals. If I couldn't be one, then at least I could study those intellectuals who build institutions, found them, reform them, in addition to engaging in the life of the mind per se. So think Humboldt's University, Froebel's Kindergarten, Drucker's Corporation, things I've written about recently. The two projects I'm working on now are also in that same vein. I think what my métier is, what my shtick is, if you will, is to ask how ideologies about the organization and purposes of knowledge act or don't act reflexively on knowledge institutions themselves, and by what mechanisms. So the first project, and I'm hoping to talk about both of them later today, is a study of a neoliberal university in Thatcher's Britain. If you know anything about academic life in the UK, you may be aware that every few years they have to go through these very elaborate, notoriously bureaucratic research selectivity, research excellence, more recently teaching excellence exercises, and that determines the funding for universities in England, Scotland, Wales, etc. And I show in this piece how that bureaucracy paradoxically grew out of the free market ideology trumpeted by Margaret Thatcher and her free market neoliberal allies and successors. And methodologically, what I try to do is to trace how these ideas about the future of capitalism were received, debated, modified, operationalized by bureaucracies at every level, from number 10 Downing Street all the way to individual academic departments at UK universities, plus a whole stratum of special interest groups, journalists, disciplinary associations, non-governmental organizations, etc. The second thing I'm working on is a book-length short book, 160-page sequel to Reinventing Knowledge, which I think of as a long synthetic essay covering US research universities from 1970 to yesterday. And it's really pitched, as was that prior book, at a crossover audience. And in particular, I'd like to reach administrators, trustees, and faculty members from outside the disciplines of history and education, even though I also hope to satisfy my fellow scholars. And I want to ask kind of where we got to where we are in academia, which in one word I think is stuck. And that's the argument of the book, as unsophisticated as it may sound. How can we get unstuck? What prospects do we see for institutional change? In terms of the style and method, the pitch of the book, I want to try to find that sweet spot between the very large genres of polemics and eulogies about liberal education, crisis of the humanities, the collapse of the public university, what college is and what ought to be. I love those books, but I want to kind of triangulate that with the higher education policy literature and higher education history, historiography that is often very empirically rich and theoretically sophisticated, but not written for that wider audience. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that I think this project, as many of our projects also do, raises questions about how we as scholars can write the histories of our own institution from inside. I'd like to think that my experience as a practicing administrator has given me some of that perspective, but I'm very interested in what others think because I'm still framing both of these projects.
Great, thank you very much. Adam.
Great, so let me also thank Emily for bringing us all together and Margaret for chairing and moderating this discussion, and to everybody and to Victoria who's handling our tech, thank you. And to everybody who's joining us from all over the country, and I know from seeing the list, some friends who are far beyond our borders. So that's really, really exciting. I think there are two things that I want to emphasize at the beginning about new directions in the history of education that all of our projects share. One is an interest in sort of transnational or international, cross-national approaches to thinking about the history of education, the history of higher education, specifically the history of the university. So I think that's really exciting, and a lot of good work is going on in that vein. Another, as Margaret highlighted at the opening, is this idea of knowledge production as material production, the history of education as part of the history of political economy, the history of capitalism. So much interesting work going on in that sort of sub-field in history generally, and I think it's enriching the history of education, the history of higher education work that's being done now. There are so many other new directions in the history of education and history of higher education that I know from looking at the list of participants that you guys who are participating today have to share. So I'm also looking forward to getting to our discussion so that we can get into some of that too, because we have a lot of experts here with us today. So a little bit about one of the projects that Margaret mentioned at the beginning that I'm working on. It's called Capital of Mind, the United States and a Global Knowledge Economy. And in this work, I'm taking some of these ideas back to the 18th century and early 19th century to think about a moment in time in which sort of our market capitalism, as we think about it in the modern period, is just coming into form within institutions of knowledge production. So this is a period, especially mid 18th century into early 19th century, of perpetual transatlantic trade wars, imperial conflict. And into that environment, institutions of knowledge production are fitting and deciding how they will play a role in service to global market capitalism and imperialism. This is some of what Emily was saying about the relationship between the university and the national state as it's coming into its modern form. And I'm very interested in the ways in which ideas and institutions that take responsibility for producing ideas commercialize those ideas, marketize those ideas, and ultimately, by the beginning of the 19th century, industrialize the production of ideas. And in the work that I'm doing, I'm fascinated by the way in which the university in its modern form is implicated in what I come to call the industrialization of ideas. And so what I'm doing in this project, Capital of Mind, is asking questions like, what happens when students and scholars are factored into a nation's calculations about its balance of trade? The flow of students and scholars, the flow of ideas, and the application of knowledge. As knowledge becomes a commodity, how exactly is it priced? Pricing is always relative to other goods. That's what economies do. So how exactly is knowledge produced? How are the producers, so how is knowledge priced? How are the producers of knowledge themselves priced? Those scholars, basically, how will they get paid? And what is the value of their production? In the international exchange of ideas, is free trade in ideas considered an advantage or a disadvantage, especially in contexts of intense protectionism and trade war behavior? Will students, scholars, ideas be encouraged to flow freely, or in a mercantilist sense, will they be encouraged to stay at home? So I'm asking these kinds of questions and watching the ways different people answer them on both sides of the Atlantic, roughly between 1750 and 1830. And I'm interested in that period because, of course, as we know, it's the period of the birth of the idea of the modern university. It's also the transition from commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism. And I think I'm hypothesizing, and I'm hoping I can successfully argue that the modern university will help us understand those processes. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. And so I'm going to continue, we're going to continue our discussion, but as we do so, I'd like to invite all the people in the audience, as you're formulating questions, as folks are talking, either in response to things people are saying or also things that you'd like to bring into the conversation, please feel free to start entering them in the Q&A. I'm going to turn to that and start integrating those questions in a few minutes. So we'd love to hear from you and have a really rich and robust discussion throughout the remainder of this hour. And as we do that, now I want to turn, Ian, to you and pose you a question sort of related to your work on the neoliberal university in the US and the UK, and in a way picking up on what Adam was just talking about these longer flows of transnational knowledge production. So how does the rise of the neoliberal university, the universities in which many of us work and teach, fit into this longer historical trajectory? What are the broader catalysts and implications of this shift? And I think more importantly, what are some things that we're not recognizing and talking enough about?
Yeah, let me focus first on the UK and then move to the US and maybe try to pull some threads together out of that. And I won't get too deeply into the kind of empirical aspects of the project, but I do want to say a few words to set things up. So as I mentioned, there are these research selectivity exercises. Every few years, faculty have to compete, universities have to compete for this bureaucracy that evaluates and audits their productivity. You can trace the infusion of lots of corporate lingo and practices, key performance indicators, value for money. And as you suggested just a second ago, Margaret, these things are familiar to us. And I would argue in very diluted form in the United States as well. So I think that's the motivation. Where does this kind of metrification, corporatization of academia actually come from? So I look at the UK as almost a kind of perfect policy laboratory, a test case of this phenomenon in its purest form, and really focus on the paradox that this highly intrusive, highly regulated state bureaucracy was constructed by politicians acting in the name of unleashing entrepreneurship, free market capitalism in the economy at large, and in the public services in particular, education, transportation, the NHS, et cetera. And there's nothing terribly original about my argument. At this phase, I say that this paradox is characteristic of neoliberalism. Unlike classical liberalism that believes that free markets are natural artifacts of human sociability and civil society, neoliberals realized they had to be artificially constructed. And what makes this interesting is that in the midst of this global discourse on free market competition that you see in everything from the United States, the UK, to Pinochet and Deng Xiaoping's China, they draw on this to solve a very specific conjunctural austerity crisis in the demographics and the finances of higher education, the malaise of the 70s and the baby bust predicted for the 1980s. And it's that elective affinity, that fusion of a neoliberal ideology to a specific crisis of knowledge production that makes this sort of a rich set of paradoxes. And what they do arguably worked beautifully. That's the yet another paradox of what I found. In the UK, they were preoccupied with brain drain from the 1950s to the 1970s. And for all the harm that they did, for all the intrusions that they enacted, for all the bungling bureaucratic incompetence of a lot of these movements. And if you talk to UK academics today, they're sort of resigned to them. If you look at the stats, Britain is still number 2 and number 3 in the world, not just per capita, but overall. They just invented a coronavirus vaccine, for Pete's sake. In 2019, they passed the 50% mark in the number of 18-year-olds seeking higher education. So while I'm not personally sympathetic to neoliberalism, I'm trying to kind of historicize this baggy epithet that we used to apply to a lot of different things, especially as aggrieved humanists, as many of us are, worried about the future of our own profession. That's at least what motivates me, trying to get some historical purchase on that. Turning briefly to the United States, I think the interesting thing about our country, and here too, I'm not terribly original, there's no plan, there's no organized ideological movement, least of all under Ronald Reagan. The federal government doesn't necessarily control much about education policy. Even the state governments no longer do. It's a perfect mess, to quote David Labaree. And so here in this country, I think you see really the core of the crisis that neoliberalism responded to. Here I'd like to suggest that it's the disciplinary organization of knowledge itself that has always been predicated on unending growth, unending expansion, unending innovation, which makes it just like capitalism itself. You can read in Adam Smith about the division of labor in academic intellectual production. That depends on the creation of new subdisciplines, new avenues of research inquiry. All those new PhDs need to get jobs. And that expansion only occurs in certain societies like 19th century Germany or post-war America. And when that limitless expansion comes to a halt in a capitalist system, you need new tools to deal with it. And in 1848, it was revolution, perhaps, led by many underemployed intellectuals. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, it's the rationing, the austerity, the introduction of a new type of artificially engineered competition as the system at least kept expanding at the same rate. And this crisis of capitalism again became mapped on to a particular demographic and fiscal crisis and the funding of universities. There's lots of other forces that are attached to this core. Things we know about: the commercialization of research, the commodification of university brands, the corporatization of administration, the consumerization of students. One thing that I guess I'd like to pull out of that is the notion that the contemporary university, which has such an emphasis on diversity and social justice, on universal access, is in some ways America's surrogate for the collapse of the welfare state after the onslaught of neoliberalism. In this country, it's very hard to get unemployment insurance, notwithstanding the pandemic, but you can go $200,000 into debt to get your BA, and no one will bat an eye. That's because that's the route to citizenship in the middle class that we now recognize. So call this neoliberalism, group it together under that heading or not. I don't want to get too fixated on that term. I think what we're not recognizing, again, to come back to my original point in Margaret's question, we need to recognize what's novel about the neoliberal period and what's not. Market competition is a feature of universities since the Middle Ages, since Bologna, Paris, Oxford. The specific charge of selling out to capitalism and the capitalism industry goes back to Veblen in 1918. Even corporate management fads, TQM, RCM, have come and gone like the tides since the Johnson administration. So what I'm trying to do is really to pin down, what's novel about this, what's specific to the period of capitalism and democracy that begins in the 1970s, and what's not. That's an open question, but one that I guess I'd like to hear others weigh in on if they're curious.
Thank you for that. So much to chew on, including the university as surrogate for the welfare state, which I think we felt quite keenly in the last 10 months as the coronavirus has created such economic hardship and other hardships for our students and our communities. And the universities and departments and units have been trying to step in, and it's a real challenge. I'd like to turn to Emily, and Emily, I have a question for you that I have, but I'd also like to integrate a question asked by Daniela Farah in the Q&A, in which I'm going to just reread her question. You mentioned how you aim to uncover marginal voices in your work. Can you elaborate on how you incorporate those perspectives into your work? And I think that builds in rather well to my question, which was about your new book, which is looking at the formative role the transatlantic crossings played in the rise of the American Research University, and of course, who was participating in those crossings and whose voices were being heard. And the question I was prompted to ask you was, if the first century plus of the research university was defined by these US and European connections, what types of international and intellectual flows characterize knowledge institutions now, and where might they go in the future? In a way, speaking to some of the things that Ian just raised in his remarks.
Right. Okay, so as you say, so much to chew on. I had planned a very short, crisp answer that is getting more complexified by the rich comments from my panelists and the questions, including what Daniela Farah posed. So I guess the thing to say is that in my new book, there's sort of two storylines. I think there's two storylines about the modern research university. And one of them is the storyline about the relationship between the university and what we might call the state. But I use that term largely recognizing the state means something different in America, in Germany. Sometimes the state is states. Sometimes the state is a national government. Sometimes the contracting partner, if you will, of a university are private benefactors. And so this term academic social contract, which I've come to use, and my colleague Mitchell Stevens at the Graduate School of Education, sociologist, and I have written about this elsewhere, I think it can be a helpful framework for thinking about the long history of some of the issues that Ian just raised. I liked that he ended on this question of part of what we are here, I think, as historians to contribute is to determine what's new and what's old, right? And I think that's an excellent point when you think about a term like neoliberalism. There's lots of terms that we've used in the last decades to describe the university, from the market university to consumer university, the entrepreneurial university. Ethan Schrum, who I know is here with us today, has an excellent new book called The Instrumental University, in which he makes the case that that's really the change in the last quarter of the 20th century. But I would argue that what's new is not the relationship. It's perhaps the terms that have changed, but that the relationship has always been one of an academic social contract, that the university has sometimes mythologized as being separate and apart from the world, but in fact, it always received autonomy in exchange for providing services to that society. And academic innovators who were successful, from Humboldt and the University of Berlin to Daniel Coit-Gilman at Johns Hopkins, were successful precisely because they found the right contracting partners and the right balance between autonomy and services. And when that contract was no longer manageable, often it expired, and it created the opportunity for new innovations to be created, and so I think that's what punctuates these different moments. Another engine of change is related to this notion of marginality that I raised, because I think that what you see in these waves of institutional change is that activist, creative, education reformers, or we can call them innovators or even entrepreneurs, often tapped underutilized talent as a source of new innovation. So, Daniel Coit-Gilman famously decides that Johns Hopkins will be non-denominational. He makes the first chair of the mathematics department a Jew who can't get a job, in the UK. Similarly, on the other side of the Atlantic, with the creation of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society and its corresponding institutes, we see in this extra university system that isn't beholden to laws and traditions of discrimination, Jews and women flock to these institutes, and these institutes become Nobel Prize winning machines, right? So there is a way that marginality becomes connected to these waves of innovation, and I think that's an important aspect of this story. Of course, the innovators on the margins are also stymied, as was W.E.B. Du Bois or Martha Carey Thomas, who wished to more fully integrate women and Blacks into the central and most prominent institutions, and had to sometimes settle for creating institutions that were on the outside rather than in the center of these systems. But I think it's important to be attuned to those inclusions and exclusions in the story. And then finally, I would say, I think this was the question that you initially posed, Margaret, about the German-American encounter. The thing to mention, and its kind of implications for the 21st century, the thing to mention is that this encounter was a two-way exchange. Right? The Americans did not cut and paste the German university in America, as it is sometimes described. The Germans and Americans cooperated and competed with one another to iterate and innovate institutions of knowledge. They had a relationship that I would call competitive emulation. So if the academic social contract governed the relationship between the university and the state, I would argue that something like competitive emulation governs the relationship among universities. Sometimes this is referred to as, the nation and the international, but it's not quite so simple, because universities within a domestic framework also engaged in these competitive emulative relationships. And I think the lesson of the story that I tell is that in this long debate between intellectual protectionists and the free exchange of ideasers that Adam Nelson mentions, goes way back to the 18th century. The lesson that I like to point to is that you can't close yourself off from your competitors, since they are also your most important collaborators, right? And I think that's that's sort of the upshot from the story. And any analysis, I think, that focuses on the ascendancy of US higher education in the 20th century misses this longer point, which is that knowledge exchange is a dynamic process in which knowledge centers, or as Margaret, as you call, cities of knowledge, move. Right? It's a geographical movement and it's an institutional movement. And decades from now, historians will be analyzing the rise of institutions, I think, that are not American. And so, if we think about where we might be looking, I've been looking to China since 2017 when I had the chance to travel with Adam Nelson to Beijing for the third Peking University of Wisconsin workshop in higher education. And I think that trans-Pacific academic exchange gave me a clearer sense of the ambition that the Americans must have harbored in the 19th century to be a place where ideas aren't just imported, but also from which ideas get exported, and the anxiety that the Germans must have felt in the previous century that their status might be slipping away. And I think that framework is helpful for thinking about the recent debates that you alluded to and that we might get to with respect to, foreign visas, to open source knowledge, to how it was that a virus was created across borders and how it might be distributed, fairly. Rather than saying who the next innovators will be, I try to provide a framework in the book for thinking about those relationships and that process in our current conversation.
Wow, that's a wonderful, rich answer. Thank you. And it perfectly keys up what I wanted to ask next and pose to Adam, which is this question about the transnational partnerships in which you have been involved, particularly between American and Chinese institutions. And tell us about what this has told you about the state of the transnational flows of ideas, but also how we should think about this as historians and historicize it, and what it means, what sort of what we might expect going forward.
Yeah, it really does dovetail perfectly with what Emily was just talking about, and in turn with what Ian was talking about before that.
A total coincidence.
It's great. So I think first what I'm going to do is put in a plug for places where people who are participating today can continue these conversations. One, at the History of Education Society, where there's a lot of sort of cross-national research going on, people coming from different places in the world to have conversations about the history of education. And also, this fall, we're meeting in San Diego, so that will be really a nice place to be. And also the International Standing Committee on the History of Education, which is meeting in Sweden in June, which is a really great place to think about cross-national questions in the history of education. So as many of us know, and as Emily was just elaborating, systems of education have been in conversation cross-nationally for centuries and centuries and centuries, if we only think in terms of the period of the modern nation state. And so understanding these systems, using the tools of transnational historical inquiry that we've really been thinking a lot about for the last decade or so, can be really, really helpful. And maybe I can just offer a couple examples of the ways I've been involved in that have enriched my own work. I'm really excited that this summer, the History of Education Review in Australia will be publishing a special issue that I co-edited with my colleague Wang Hui Min at Zhejiang University, which will be, we think, the first ever English language special issue on the history of education, populated entirely by scholars from China, about history of education in China. Because while we occasionally see a piece about the history of education in China in our English language journals in the field, we haven't really ever brought together body of scholars in one special issue for an English language audience. And I'm hoping that when it comes out, people will start to incorporate those essays into their courses, and that will become part of our subdiscipline, subfield. As Emily mentioned, the University of Wisconsin Peking University Workshop on Higher Education takes place every year, either in Beijing or Madison, to think about how we can learn from each other in terms of just content in the history of education, but also methods of studying the history of education. What archives are available? What archives might we think need to be available more in the future? How can we build the infrastructure for our field across national conversations? I think those things are very important for the future of the field, because we've had good discussions transatlantically, and we need to build better discussions trans-Pacifically, including with the help of the American Historical Association. We have another workshop on specifically the history of education with the University of Wisconsin and Zhejiang University, and that meets every other year, to really think about how we can maintain those intellectual ties that Emily and Ian have also been talking about, that are fruitfully collaborative and competitive, that enrich knowledge across space. I do want to note that the Warren Center at Harvard, its next round of scholars will be studying slavery and the university. Sven Beckert and his colleagues are leading that up. And that too is going to be an opportunity to think about a very important question, slavery and the university, but also, I hope, in international or cross-geographic spaces, so that questions of trade and human capital, as they contributed to, not human capital in the worst possible sense of enslaved human beings, contributed to the making of American institutions of higher education. So I'm hopeful that as we go forward, more and more work in our field will be enriched by those cross-national conversations. The field of higher education in the United States tends to be quite myopic in its American focus. And in the 21st century, we really have an opportunity to broaden and internationalize that work. So I want to leave it there, because I know we have probably some really great questions from our participants today.
Thank you, Adam. And we do, and I want to turn now to a question posed at the top by Steve Lipson, who's interested in knowing what the relationship is between current historical research in the field of higher education and that of elementary and secondary K-12 education. Do you see the two fields speaking to each other? Is the current research in the fields asking similar or different questions? And are you all aware of interesting efforts to look at K-12 education and higher education together? I'm going to throw that open to all three of you, because I think all of you have something to speak to that. Who would like to take that up first?
I'll start and try to be very brief. So it's such a good question, because I do think historically, the historiography on K-12 education and higher education has been too distinct, and that there have been relatively few attempts to bring these lines of inquiry together. But there have been a few areas where I think this has been pursued successfully. One is the question of, basically in education terms, articulation. So how well are students moving from one level of the system to the next level of the system? And what is the preparatory function of K-12 education? And how is higher education constantly adjusting or failing to adjust itself to those preparatory functions? But another now is the very important social justice question of access. which is related to that question. And as we think about how the institutions of higher education are or are not accessible to diverse populations of students, we're seeing more and more work on how K-12 education and higher education are interdependent, functionally and organizationally. And I'm hopeful that we'll see even more about that question around the way in which both or all levels of education serve a diverse population and diverse populations. So I think there's some good work coming out, and there's more that will be done soon.
Great. Ian, your thoughts?
It's a great question, and it's one that sort of slaps me on the forehead. And, you know, I should have thought of that myself, because it opens up such a rich set of thoughts. All I have to offer are a couple of methodological suggestions and notes from my own experience, which is to look at areas where higher ed and K-12 actually interface or interdigitate. So transfer and articulation, counting high school credit for college credit, that's one area. Another where there's been some good work done, I'm thinking of Ellen Nagelman's classic book on elusive science on education schools, looking at schools of education in universities and the way they're torn between the mandate of training teachers, which is their crucial function, but relatively low prestige. And then this is true of our own ed school at the University of Oregon. They focus on things that are funded by the DOE and even the NSF and the NIH. And they look more like psychologists in an arts and sciences college. So looking at schools of education as a way in which the rubber hits the road in terms of making these two interact is important. And then from my own experience, the big book that I never got around to written and may never yet write. I'm an 18th century, 19th century Germanist by training. You can argue that the Germans pioneered the world's very first system of public education. It starts in kindergarten and ends with a PhD, and those are the two institutions that bookend education all over the world now. I did get so far as the kindergarten, didn't ascend any higher after that, but if someone wants to pick up that charge, that would be a huge contribution to the literature.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly and we can move on. I'm sure there's other questions that we want to get to. And I see Ethan has also raised a point about the private versus public system in America. It's a really hard question. I think that the scholarships have remained distinct for lots of reasons, and Adam and Ian have touched on those. I think articulation is one area in which my book addresses sort of the K-12, the history of K-12. Schooling, to the extent that academic reformers, in particular in the Midwest, but also in the Northeast in the 19th century, at some point realized that they wanted to control the students that were entering the universities, and realized that the only way they could do that is if they got involved in questions about the standards and standardization of high schools and admissions, and so we start to see that articulation developed in the 19th century. I too was going to mention Ian's work on Froebel, and I think it's a shame that there haven't been more attempts to kind of connect these different movements. I'll give a plug to our student in the Graduate School of Education, Daniel Smith, who's working on common school reformers in a transatlantic context, from Horace Mann to Victor Cousin to the Belgians, and looking exactly at this question of how the history of common schooling emerges just as the birth of social sciences is emerging, and tries to integrate that history into a sort of transatlantic history of the social sciences. But I think that there's, and then the last point I would say that just hasn't been mentioned is, I think, in David Labourie's oeuvre, his work on credentialism, I think, is another area where we might see, building on David's important work, the ways that the high schools and community colleges are part of a ladder-based system of credentialing in which institutions have historically tried to raise themselves up in this ladder, and then that's had sort of detrimental effects on how we deliver vocational or liberal arts education, kind of squeezed in the institutions that are squeezed in the middle. And I think that's an area for future research in which we can try to understand how those systems have developed on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thanks. This question of public and private universities, which is posed not just by Ethan Shrum, but also Christina Groger in the Q&A, is and really elite, non-elite too, which of course those are overlapping, but not totally similar, equal categories. And it's true that certainly in the United States, the discussion and the policy discussion and even the historiography kind of focuses on elite institutions often. And certainly the way that colleges and universities are talked about in the popular media is often as if everyone's just going to 7 schools and the other ones don't exist. And that the vast majority of American college-going American adults are going to other types of institutions. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Perhaps, Ian, I know I think this is very closely related to some of the things you've been doing in your work. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, 2 great questions. I think that I'm gonna push a kind of devil's advocate hypothesis or thesis and say that the prominence of private universities undermines the case that nationalist agendas set higher education, the parameters of higher education competition. The reason is that these private universities, with the key exceptions of the ways they served the Cold War in the United States, and Margaret and others have written about that, are basically after their own game. And what that means is that the next tier imitates that tier, and the tier under that imitates them. So the Oregons of the world are always chasing the Wisconsins and the Washingtons of the world. The Wisconsins and the Washingtons of the world are always chasing the Stanfords of the world. And here we are representing those institutions, and so on and so forth. So I would argue in response to Ethan and Christina that the discourse of austerity is created inadvertently by the elite private institutions because they set up a competition whereby the public flagships have to scrimp and save to recruit science faculty and build big facilities and rock climbing walls and lazy rivers and all these things. And they're as much responsible without malevolent intent as the state lawmakers who are always cutting the budget to fund prisons and civil service pensions and things like that. And so this is shamelessly cribbed from David Labarie's book and many others who've argued that that elite pinnacle sets the system. And the way in which I'd like to suggest that it really has a systemic impact is that it really does undermine the objectives of state policymakers, either at the level of subnational states like United States or federal governments to really set higher education priorities for an entire system. And the exception that proves the rule again is the UK.
Thank you for that. Adam, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just going to make a very short point about a book that in a way connects our last questions about K-12 and higher education and this question about public and private. And it's an edited volume that Chris Loss and Pat McGuinn put together a few years ago about the convergence of K-12 and higher education policy in the United States, more or less in the last half century or 3/4 of a century. And specifically in more recent times about the ways in which K-12 and higher education policies have, at the federal level in particular, increasingly tried to balance sort of public and private providers when it comes to making space for voucher programs in the courts, or making space for the ways in which federal funds can flow to different kinds of private schools, parochial schools, and so on, as a way to sort of reorganize the system of education provision in the United States, echoes some of the ways in which the higher education system has been put together in the United States over very long periods of time, in the way in which government has subsidized and supported through student aid or through research aid, both public and private institutions, to rationalize the system on a national basis. That book raises some of those really interesting and very important questions about how K-12 education and higher education reflect policies in the other domain, and that public and private are operating and have for a long time operated together in those spaces. There are many other works that do that kind of thing, but Chris Loss and Pat McGuinn's book on the convergence of K-12 higher education policy gets into some of those issues in ways that I think are generative historiographically.
That's a great recommendation. I'm thinking as a follow-up for this panel, we'll think about ways we can take the work that you all have done and the work that's been mentioned in this panel and figure out how we, I don't know, tweet it out, put it together, create a resource for those both in the audience and those not. And if anyone would like to put suggestions, historiographic suggestions in the Q&A, perhaps you can contribute to that. Emily.
Yeah, I just will add just one also methodological point to this very important line of inquiry about the heterogeneity of institutions in the U.S., or as we've now referred to David Lavery's book a number of times, the perfect mess. I mean, I think that the distinct contribution we make as historians is that we always choose what's core and what's peripheral, whether it's the individuals that we choose to center or it's the institutions. And I think our colleagues who write about universities or colleges in the public conversation, who aren't writing primarily for an academic audience, sometimes assume that Harvard, equals America. And I think, one of the surprises of a history of higher education in America in a transatlantic context that you get like in a book like mine is you see, Harvard, it wasn't a leader, it was a follower, right? And Charles Eliot famously thought that the idea of a hybrid institution that combined the liberal arts of the English style with the German graduate school giving a PhD, would never have legs in America. And boy, was he wrong. And it's only once he sees it take off that he realizes he has to sort of graft that on to the older institution, Harvard. And then, of course, they eventually will leapfrog over it, right? So when you historicize, I think with nuance, you get this kind of complexity and these richness and these kind of surprises that emerge. And I think you can kind of show over the course of a longue durée the way that as the modern research university I see here in the chat, it has been sometimes given too much perhaps prominence in a history of the 19th century. We can see in the decade of the 20s and the 30s, the way that the liberal arts colleges revived in opposition to German notions of universities and research. And we get a whole kind of wave of foundings from Black Mountain College to Bennington, to Reed, to colleges that are searching for other frameworks beyond the German that's been largely discredited by World War I. So I mean, when you lengthen the time period, that complexity, I think, emerges, and that's one of the things that we as historians can contribute to the conversation.
Thank you for that. We're coming up to the close of the hour. So as we are, again, as I said at the top, we're going to go around an hour, but go a little, I wanted to give us latitude to go a little over. And now I'm really glad I did, because I'd like to end with a round robin with a moonshot question posed by Miss Mitchell Stevens in the Q&A, who, Mitchell, I count on you for the moonshots. Thank you. One big part, he writes, one big part of the mid-20th century US story is that colleges and universities mobilized and were mobilized to address major national projects and problems. Is it possible to imagine such joint venture mobilization of universities in the current moment in the US or elsewhere? Who would like to take on this big meaty question? I'm gonna like to give each of you a couple of minutes just to say your piece on what you think. Emily, you have the floor. I'm gonna give it back to you. I'm gonna put you first, unless you'd like a little more time to think about it.
No, I mean, thanks, Mitchell. Thanks, Mitchell. Look, we can dream, right? I mean, we can work on these kinds of efforts, and we are. And I think this is a moment. This is a moment not to be wasted. It's a moment that I think we're seeing a great interest in the history. As to go back to the beginning, as Adam was saying, we're interested in migration, we're interested in capitalism. So we're seeing an uptick in the history of migration, the history of capitalism, and that's something you see often at these AHA society meetings. Is kind of the opportunity to come together and think about how we as historians in the Guild might draw on our unique contributions to, to help our, help look backwards in order to go forwards. And I think, that's part of what we're doing here. And Margaret, you've done that so wonderfully in your work, which we haven't had a chance to look at in this hour, but I know has been influential for all of us in looking, for example, at the tremendous role that the government has played, that played in the creation of this university that I'm sitting in now at Stanford and Silicon Valley, even though we here like to erase that history of the entrepreneurial government. And so one question that I know you've raised and that is implicit, I think, in Mitchell's question is to what extent, there is an appetite in a federal government for that kind of partnerships, or to what extent we might be finding those partnerships elsewhere. Who will be the next partners for the academic social contracts of the 21st century? Will they be billionaires, I'm drawing a blank on the philanthropist who just gave billions of dollars to the HBCUs. Margaret, maybe you can help me out. Maggie, sorry, you're muted.
I lost my mouse connection.
Sorry.
Mackenzie Scott,
Mackenzie
former
Scott, exactly.
Bezos, the former wife of Jeff Bezos.
Thank you so much for helping me out with that detail there. I mean, I think the point of that story is that it's not clear where the partners are going to come from in this moment. And I think we might be open to different kinds of arrangements that we haven't seen yet in the future. And I think that's where the possibility lies. And we can use the formulations of the past to think about new openings in the future. And that's the positive message that I'll choose to end on there. There's many more, of course, negative ones and of the aggrieved humanists that we could also focus on, but I'll pick that one instead.
Thank you. Ian, what's your take?
Yeah, so, if you look at the history of academia, you go back to the Republic of Letters in the early modern period, and scholars have always organized themselves around solving big problems. In that case, the fracturing of Western Christianity into rival confessions. So, with the proviso that you should never ask an historian to predict the future, because that's, at least in my personal experience, something that I've always been bad at doing. I want to just lay out 3 silver linings of the year 2020. Number one is that the International Republic of Letters did create in record time, not 1, but 2 unbelievably effective coronavirus vaccines. And if you read the pages of the journal Science, you'll see that, Chinese scholars, European scholars, North American scholars from all over the world contributed to that effort in record time. Number 2 is that this is really grasping at straws, but the United States effectively resigned from its position as global hegemon in the most undignified and dispiriting way possible. But I hope in future years will lead other nations collectively to pick up the baton where we have so dramatically failed. And number 3 is what we're doing right now. This format, I think, of international, the way in which all scholars leapt upon Zoom and found ways to interact that have always been there, even before the internet itself. I think what's going to happen as soon as the pandemic is conquered is we're all going to go back to face-to-face teaching, but we're not going to give up the advantages of this type of academic sociability. So if we could, it's a very pious hope and perhaps naive to think that the weakening of nationalist competition in which the United States has just thrown its weight around, in combination with the sort of effervescence that always comes up in terms of international collaboration, will allow some of these big problems to be solved in a decentralized way that will be a break from the kind of big science, moonshot, atom bomb, invest billions of federal dollars into it. which is sort of implicit in Mitchell's question.
Adam.
It's a really great question. I share Ian's hesitation as a historian about speculating about the future. But I guess I'm reminded first that the history of the university is riddled with sentiments that the university couldn't possibly handle the challenges of its time and that it needed to be replaced by some other entity that could do a better job. And so we could go back very, very far to find those kinds of concerns. And somehow the university has survived, and I would argue maybe even has thrived and grown. I would also, Mitchell's question is, can the university basically help to address global or big problems? And I think of course, the vaccines in our own time. We can imagine what role the university might play in some other really big dilemmas like space or the environment. But I'm thinking then in terms of not just what to do about climate change, but what to do about environmental responsibility. And that leads me to a role of the university that we're at a juncture that it's hard to talk about, but necessary to talk about. And that is the university's role in constructing citizens. That idea that the university somehow had a role in constructing citizens, whether it was citizens of a faith body or citizens of a city, state, Bologna, and so on, or the role of citizens in the national state. And I think that role of the university has become an urgent role. I think the events of recent times have shown that the whole system of education has an important responsibility to play in helping our societies think about citizenship and the meanings of citizenship, the obligations of citizenship, the responsibilities of citizenship, and the rewards of citizenship. And if we continue that conversation within the university, or let's say higher education, because I agree with our participants who said we tend to focus on the idea of a research university or elite universities altogether too much. And this work happens on a much grander scale in other kinds of institutions of higher education whose role is imperative. I think that if we continue to do that historical work about the university's role in constructing citizens, we'll come to some really, really important conversations about how that might happen in the future. Those conversations in the historiography among historians often bring us face to face with some very uncomfortable truths about the university's role in constructing citizens and defining citizenship. They aren't always pleasant conversations. They aren't always uplifting, if only we could do it that way again conversations. They're often, here are some of the sources of the dilemmas that we face around these issues today. But I think that the university has been a site of having those kinds of conversations for a very long time. And I hope that that function of the university, that role of the university, that virtue of the university is one that in our historiography, we continue to do very good critical work around. So I'm just going to highlight that part. I think that's a big challenge to Mitchell's question, and I hope the university of all social institutions can play a prominent role.
Thank you. I too, I think we need looking for silver linings as well as having a very, looking very honestly at the university's past is the way that we get to this. My take on the moonshots is, if one silver lining, possibly, we don't know quite yet. I think 2021, the rest of 2021 may help us understand whether, at least in the US, this is going to come to pass. But the multiple crises, interrelated crises of 2020 and into 21, the silver lining is that perhaps it will make expertise more valued again and perhaps make government great again, or at least appreciating the role of having robust a robust public sector that's allowed to be a partner with the private sector, with the educational sector, and this broader question of citizenship. The value of not just, people need to take more classes in history and philosophy, although that's always good, but really the broader project of liberal education, in which everyone on this panel has been deeply engaged, and historicizing that, understanding the long history of market relationships between states, markets, and higher education over time, these long and very complicated and often ugly project of citizenship. And I think the question, that all of your work addresses, the transnational nature of the work and the transnational nature of the historiography, of the work of so many people, both on this call and people in the field of higher education and the field of education. The internationalism of these institutions will also be, I think, where we do not need grand national projects. We do not necessarily need to, the US needs to beat China. That these are internationalist institutions from the start, and we need to recognize that is, that their value comes in part from that internationalism and advancing these not only national projects but supranational ones, and projects of humanity. So let's all hope for a brighter future ahead for humanity, democracy, and higher education and the people in it. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of you for being on the line. We will try to think creatively about ways in which we can add on to sort of bring in some of the conversation and the work. Well, I don't know, we'll have to figure out what some venue we can keep the conversation going, but let's please do keep the conversation going, and let's look forward to the next time we all meet in person at the next in-person AHA or History of Education Society or other collegial events. So thank you all, and have a good weekend. We all need one.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.